The gate did not look dangerous from the outside. It looked like a bruise in the air, a smear of violet light hanging over a ruined subway platform, and Kim Tae-hyun had walked past 100 gates just like it. He was 35 years old, and he had learned a long time ago that the world did not care how hard a man tried. It only cared what he could do. He found that out again in the last 30 seconds of his life. The monster that came through the gate was not supposed to exist at that rank. The association had logged it as an A-class anomaly. Maybe a rogue B if the readings were wrong. It was neither. It was Asodius, and the moment it stepped fully into the world, 3 of his teammates dropped where they stood, their bodies simply forgetting how to keep working. No wound, no blood, just an absence, the kind a body cannot survive. Tae-hyun had spent 16 years training for a moment like this. He had a decent blade, a body conditioned past what most awakened bothered to condition theirs, and a mind that had studied every scrap of combat knowledge available to an unawakened man who refused to accept the label. None of it mattered. Asodius did not fight him so much as observe him, tilting its head the way a man might study an insect he had already decided to crush. It showed him things instead of killing him outright. That was the cruelty of it. He felt his mind dragged backward through his own memories, forced to relive them at a speed and clarity no human recollection allowed. He saw his parents' car folding in on itself on a rain-slick overpass, saw it from an angle he had never actually witnessed, as if the monster had reached into the wound and widened it on purpose. He saw his uncle's house, the spare room he had lived in for 9 years, the way his cousin's mother had counted out his portion of rice, a little smaller than everyone else's, and never once looked at him while doing it. He saw a school gymnasium and a boy named Ba-huku standing over him with a foot on his chest, laughing, while 30 other students watched and did nothing. This was the world's answer to a man who worked hard without power. Not cruelty delivered all at once. Cruelty delivered patiently, over years, until it became background noise. And now, at the very end, the universe had arranged for him to feel all of it again in the same breath he was about to die in. Asodius tore his arm free at the shoulder, as almost an afterthought, more curious than vicious, and Tae-hyun understood with total clarity that strength was the only truth this world respected. Everything else, decency, effort, the quiet dignity of doing the right thing when no one was there to reward it, was a story people told each other to make the powerlessness bearable. He had believed that story for 35 years. He stopped believing it while looking up at a monster he could not touch. That should have been the end of him. It nearly was. Instead, something enormous folded space around him the instant before the finishing blow landed, and a presence that felt older than the concept of gates itself spoke into the dying wreck of his mind. It did not sound like a voice so much as a decision being made somewhere far above him. It told him, in fragments he would not fully understand for a long time, that his death here was a waste it could not permit, that there was a role waiting for him, a purpose larger than one broken body in a subway station, that it would give him a chance most men were never offered, a second chance built on a stolen power. He did not remember agreeing. He remembered pain, and then he remembered nothing, and then he remembered waking up. To understand what he woke into, it helps to go back further than that platform, further than the gate. Back to a boy who lost his parents on a highway before he was old enough to properly grieve them, who was taken in by an uncle's family out of obligation rather than warmth, who slept in the smallest room of the house and learned early that gratitude was the rent he paid for a roof. He was never awakened. In a world where power now decided a person's worth before anything else did, that single fact made him invisible in the best moments and a target in the worst. His cousin, Wang Jae-yong, was the one relative who never treated him like a burden, a loud, directionless kid 2 years younger who followed him around out of genuine affection rather than pity. Everyone else adjusted their kindness to match his uselessness. School was where the arithmetic of the new world got taught most bluntly. Ba-huku ran his year the way small tyrants run anything they are allowed to, with a rotating cast of friends who found his casual violence entertaining and a faculty that looked away because Ba-huku's family had money. Tae-hyun absorbed the hits, the mockery, the small daily erosion of being treated as less, and did not fight back in any way that would have mattered. Fighting back required strength he did not have, and the system offered no path to acquire. So he built one anyway, out of stubbornness alone. He read every book on unarmed combat the library carried. He ran until his lungs burned and then ran further. He picked up scraps of martial arts from a retired instructor who taught him for free out of something between amusement and pity, and he practiced those scraps until they stopped being scraps. None of it awakened him. None of it gave him a rank, a class, or a status window like the ones his classmates flaunted. It only made him a very fit, very disciplined nobody, which was arguably a crueler outcome than staying soft, because it meant he had to watch his effort fail to matter in real time. He carried that discipline into adulthood the way some men carry a grudge. He became a support hand for licensed hunting parties, the kind of unawakened worker who carried supplies, scouted terrain, and occasionally, when everyone else's power failed at the worst possible second, stepped in with raw skill and refused to die. He was good at not dying. He was good at almost everything except the one thing the world had decided actually counted. By the time he turned 35, he had built something like a life, not a comfortable one. He still lived plainly, still sent money to his uncle's family out of habit, more than affection, still kept his cousin close, as the one relationship that had never asked anything of him except to exist. He had scars, a decent reputation among the crews that would still hire an unawakened man, and a quiet certainty that he had made the most of a hand that never should have been playable. Then a subway station gate misjudged its own rank, and a Sodius stepped through, and all of that quiet certainty burned away inside 30 seconds. He woke up on a different morning entirely. The ceiling above him was one he had not seen in 17 years, water-stained in the corner from a leak his uncle's family never bothered fixing. His hands, when he lifted them in front of his face, were a teenager's hands, unscarred, unbroken, both of them present and attached. He lay there for a long moment doing nothing but breathing, because the alternative was panic, and panic was a luxury a dying man does not usually get offered twice. A calendar tacked to the wall told him the date before anything else did. It was 1 month before the gate at the abandoned station was scheduled to misjudge its own rank. 1 month before 3 teammates would drop dead without a mark on them. 1 month before an arm would be torn from its socket by something that considered him beneath conversation. He was 19 again, in a body that had never worked a day for anything, carrying the full weight of a mind that had spent 35 years learning exactly how little that innocence was worth. There is a particular kind of vertigo that comes from being handed your childhood back once you already know how the story ends. Taehyun sat up slowly, testing the strange lightness of a body that had not yet earned its calluses, and felt something else stir beneath the surface of his own thoughts. Not a memory, a presence, faint but unmistakable, coiled somewhere at the edge of his awareness like a second set of instincts waiting to be used. He did not know yet what to call it. He only knew it had not been there yesterday, in whatever life yesterday belonged to. Downstairs, he could hear his aunt's voice through the thin walls, sharp with the particular irritation she reserved only for him, telling someone that breakfast was not going to wait. He recognized the tone instantly. He had heard it every morning for years before he moved out, and hearing it again now, from a body 17 years younger, hit him harder than he expected. It was proof this was real. No dream bothered to recreate irritation this precisely. His cousin Wang Jae-yong banged on the door a moment later, already talking before Taehyun had opened it. Some complaint about a girl at school and a debt he owed to a group of older kids who were not the patient type. Taehyun looked at him properly for the first time since waking. This loud, undisciplined boy who would grow, in the life Taehyun remembered, into one of the only people who never stopped being loyal to him no matter how bad things got. Right now, Jae-yong was just a kid who did not know yet that his cousin had died and come back with something monstrous curled up inside him. Taehyun told him to get ready for school. His own voice came out steadier than he expected, given everything. School was where the harsh truth of this new life introduced itself properly. He remembered the exact date this was, remembered it because it was burned into him from the version of events he had already lived through once. Today was the day Bahuku decided to make an example of him in front of the class, over something as small as an unreturned favor, the kind of manufactured grievance bullies always kept in reserve for slow afternoons. In his first life he had taken it, the shove, the humiliation, the laughter, because fighting back would have cost him more than swallowing it did. He was not planning to swallow it twice. The confrontation happened exactly where he remembered it happening, in the corridor outside the gymnasium, Bahuku flanked by 2 friends who existed mostly to laugh on command. The shove came the same way it always had, a flat hand to the chest meant to knock him back into the lockers. Except this time, something in Taehyun's body answered the impact before his mind fully caught up to what was happening. He did not fly backward, he barely moved. Bahuku's expression flickered, the first crack in 17 years of casual dominance, and Taehyun felt the strange presence inside him stir again, warmer this time, almost eager. He looked down at his own hand and saw nothing unusual, no glow, no status window, nothing the world would recognize as power. And yet something had absorbed that shove the way a wall absorbs a light rain. He did not understand it yet. He only understood that the boy standing across from him, who had spent years treating him like something to be stepped on, suddenly looked less certain of the arithmetic he had built his whole reputation on. Taehyun did not raise a hand, not yet. He only stood there, meeting Bahuku's eyes with a calm that had no business belonging to a 19-year-old, a calm built out of 35 years of practice, and one very recent death. It unsettled the bully more than any punch could have. Bullies like Bahuku ran on fear working the way it was supposed to. When it stopped working, they had nothing left to fall back on. The friends noticed the silence stretch a beat too long. One of them laughed nervously, the kind of laugh meant to fill a gap rather than express anything real. Bahuku shoved him again, harder, more out of the need to prove something to himself than to actually hurt him, and this time, Taehyun let his body do what it clearly wanted to do without asking permission. He caught the wrist before it connected. Not fast in a way that would have impressed a professional hunter. Fast in a way that should have been physically impossible for an unawakened teenager who, as far as the world's rules went, had no business surviving a real fight, let alone winning one on instinct alone. Bahuku's face went through several emotions in quick succession: confusion, anger, something close to fear, before Taehyun let go of his wrist and stepped back. Not because he was finished, but because he wanted to see how far this new strength actually reached before he committed to anything permanent. A crowd had gathered by then, the way crowds always gather when the social order looks like it might be cracking. Nobody said anything, they just watched. He walked away from that corridor with his uniform unwrinkled and his pulse barely elevated. And somewhere behind his ribs, the presence that had followed him back from death curled tighter. Satisfied, patient, waiting for him to figure out what exactly it was and what it wanted from him. He spent the rest of that day in a strange, suspended calm, going through the motions of a school schedule he remembered only in outline, aware the entire time that something fundamental had changed in him that had nothing to do with muscle memory or hard-won discipline. The old Taehyun had built his entire identity on being the man who succeeded through effort alone, the one exception to a world that ran on inherited power. That identity had died on a subway platform along with the rest of him. Whatever had replaced it did not feel entirely human. It felt like appetite. That evening, alone in the small room he had once resented and now found almost unbearably familiar, he finally let himself think about what the presence in his chest might actually be. He closed his eyes and reached toward it the way he might reach toward a held breath, and for a fraction of a second something answered. Not words, an impression. Hunger, ancient and enormous, wrapped around a single word that felt less like language and more like a title stamped onto the core of his new existence. Predation. He did not know yet what it could do beyond absorbing a shove that should have sent him into a locker. He did not know about the fatigue thresholds that would later limit how much of it he could safely use, or the fact that this stolen power was not entirely his own, that somewhere inside him a second consciousness had come along for the ride, quietly cataloging everything he took. He only knew that a boy who had spent his entire first life being told his effort did not matter had been handed, by something calling itself a king, exactly the kind of power the world actually respected. The question was what he intended to do with it, now that he had a month of foreknowledge, a body too young to have earned any of its scars yet, and a growing certainty that the gate at the abandoned subway station was only the first small tremor of something far larger waiting on the other side of every violet-tinted rift in the world. He was 19 years old again, and for the second time in his life, he intended to prove that he was not the nobody everyone around him had already decided he was. The days between waking up and the subway station gate breaking should have felt long. They did not. Taehyun spent them the way a man spends a week he knows is borrowed, cataloging every small thing about this world he might have forgotten to notice the first time through. He tested predation carefully, in private, in the small hours before his aunt woke to start breakfast. He pushed against the wall of his own room with a fraction of the force Bahuku's shove had answered, and felt nothing unusual happen, just a normal boy's arm against plaster. It was not raw strength sitting inside him waiting to be flexed. It was something conditional, something that responded to threat and pressure rather than intention alone. He filed that away. A power that only woke up under duress was a power he would have to provoke to understand. He also noticed, in those quiet mornings, that his thoughts moved differently than they used to. Faster in places, sharper in others, as if the presence sharing space in his mind had lent him a fraction of whatever perspective it carried. He caught himself calculating angles and outcomes in ordinary conversations, the way he once only did in combat. His aunt asked him twice that week if he was feeling well. He told her he was fine. He was not lying exactly. He simply did not have language yet for what he actually was. His cousin Jae-young noticed something too, though he read it differently. He kept saying Tae-hyun seemed lighter somehow, less like a kid quietly enduring his own life, and more like someone with a plan. Jae-young did not know how right he was. He only knew his cousin had stopped flinching at things that used to make him flinch, and he liked this new version enough to start following him around even more than usual, which was saying something. Word about the corridor incident with Bahuku spread the way these things always spread in a school full of bored teenagers. Nobody had actually seen power used, not in any way the awakened world would recognize, but everyone had seen Bahuku's wrist caught mid-shove and his face doing something none of them had ever seen it do before. Bahuku himself kept his distance for the rest of the week, which told Tae-hyun everything he needed to know about how much of the boy's old cruelty had been confidence rather than substance. He let the rumors simmer without confirming or denying anything. He had bigger problems circling on the calendar than one bully's wounded pride. The date arrived the way dates in a life already lived tend to arrive, quietly, disguised as an ordinary morning. Tae-hyun remembered this one specifically because it was the day a maintenance crew reported minor instability in a long-sealed gate beneath an abandoned train station on the edge of the city. The kind of report that usually meant nothing and occasionally meant everything. In his first life, he had heard about this gate secondhand, a footnote in a report he skimmed on a slow shift. This time he intended to be standing much closer to it than any footnote required. He told his aunt he was meeting friends. He told Jae-young the truth, or close enough to it, that something interesting was happening near the old station, and he wanted to see it. Jae-young, predictably, invited himself along, and Tae-hyun let him, partly because dragging his cousin away entirely felt like tempting a version of fate he did not fully trust yet, and partly because some small, still human part of him wanted the company. The station itself looked exactly as unimpressive as he remembered it looking. Chain-link fencing gone soft with rust, a scatter of official vehicles parked at careless angles, a handful of licensed players in city-issued vests standing around a barrier tape line with the bored posture of people expecting a slow afternoon. The gate itself, visible through a collapsed section of the old platform roof, pulsed the dull violet color the association's classification system had logged as consistent with a low C-rank breach. Tae-hyun had read that classification once, in another life, and had believed it. He did not believe it now. He remembered exactly how wrong that C-rank reading turned out to be. He remembered the moment the barrier team realized their equipment had misjudged the gate's true depth, and he remembered how badly that mistake cost them before backup arrived. What he did not remember, because he had never been close enough to see it the first time, was how it actually happened, moment to moment, the details a footnote report never bothered to include. He was about to find out from far too close a seat. It started small. A tremor in the ground that most of the onlookers mistook for a passing train, except no trains ran through this station anymore. Then the violet light thickened, deepened, the way a bruise darkens before it fully blooms, and one of the licensed players near the barrier tape said something into a radio that made his voice climb half an octave higher than professional composure usually allowed. Jae-young, standing close enough to see the shift in tone, asked what was happening. Tae-hyun told him to get back, and something in his own voice must have carried more weight than a 19-year-old's voice usually did, because his cousin actually listened without arguing, which was rare enough to be its own kind of warning sign. The gate did not simply open. It tore, the way overstretched fabric tears, a widening seam of violet light that spat out something far larger than the C-rank breach the readings had promised. Tae-hyun watched 3 licensed players scramble for a coordinated response that assumed a threat tier they were about to discover was badly, dangerously wrong. He recognized the mismatch immediately, the way a man recognizes a familiar shape of disaster even in unfamiliar lighting. This was an A-rank breach wearing a C-rank's paperwork. The first monster through the seam was low to the ground, segmented, moving with the wrong kind of speed for something that size, closing the distance to the nearest player before the man's stance had finished adjusting. Taehyun saw the exact instant the player realized his equipment rating did not match the threat in front of him, saw the flicker of calculation that came a half-second too late. He did not think about it the way people usually describe thinking in moments like this. There was no internal debate, no weighing of consequences. There was only the presence in his chest, surging forward to meet a threat, the way it had surged forward to meet Bahuku's shove. Except this time, the threat was real enough to kill someone in the next 3 seconds if nobody intervened. He moved. Jae-yong called out something behind him, panic sharpening the edges of his voice. But Taehyun was already past the barrier tape, already closing on a fight that should have had absolutely nothing to do with an unlicensed 19-year-old who, as far as the world's rules were concerned, had no business surviving contact with anything above an E-rank threat. He caught the segmented creature's strike on his forearm the way he had caught Bahuku's wrist, except this impact carried enough force to crater pavement, and instead of shattering bone the way it should have, something in him absorbed the blow and turned it into raw information, a hungry, cataloging sensation spreading up through his arm and settling somewhere behind his ribs. The presence inside him surged with something close to pleasure. The creature reeled back, more startled than hurt, clearly unprepared for an obstacle that had not behaved the way soft human tissue was supposed to behave. Taehyun did not give it time to recalibrate. He drove a strike into its exposed underside with a precision his old, unawakened body had never possessed. A strike built on 16 years of studied martial technique, now finally paired with strength worth the effort behind it. The creature went still. Somewhere behind him, one of the licensed players said something that was mostly just a stunned exhale of a curse word. Taehyun did not turn to acknowledge it. He was already tracking the second and third shapes emerging from the widening seam, aware that the true depth of this breach had barely begun to reveal itself. Aware that somewhere in the association's chain of command, someone was about to have a very bad morning, discovering exactly how wrong their instruments had been. He felt the presence in his chest, cataloged the kill with the same quiet satisfaction it had shown after the corridor confrontation. A faint pulse of something settling into place inside him, a new thread of ability now folded into whatever he was becoming. He did not fully understand yet what he had just gained. He only understood that predation was not a single trick. It was an accumulation, and it had just started accumulating in earnest. Behind the barrier tape, Jae-yong stood frozen, staring at his cousin standing in the middle of a fight, 3 ranks above what any unawakened person should have survived. And for the first time since the sun came up that morning, he looked less like a delinquent following his cousin around out of boredom, and more like a boy watching something he did not have words for yet. Taehyun turned back toward the seam, toward whatever else the gate intended to spit out before the day was finished, and felt, underneath the adrenaline and the strange new hunger settling into his chest, the quiet certainty that this was only the first of many mornings the world was about to badly misjudge him. The second shape through the seam moved differently than the first, slower, heavier, dragging a presence with it that made the air around the platform feel thinner somehow, like the space itself was making room for something it did not want to hold. Taehyun recognized the shift immediately, not from memory this time. From instinct, the kind the presence in his chest seemed to lend him whenever a threat crossed some invisible line from dangerous into something worse. The licensed players behind him had regrouped enough to form a rough perimeter, though their faces still carried the particular pallor of people who had watched their entire threat assessment collapse in under a minute. One of them, older, a woman with a captain's insignia on her vest, was shouting into a radio for immediate reinforcement and a revised classification. Her voice clipped in the way professionals get when panic is a luxury they cannot afford yet. Taehyun did not wait for reinforcements. Reinforcements, in his memory of how this day was supposed to go, arrived 12 minutes too late to matter for the people standing closest to the breach. The second creature unfolded itself the rest of the way through the seam, revealing a shape somewhere between insect and something that had never been given a proper name, limbs too numerous and too jointed for the eye to track cleanly. It fixed on the nearest cluster of civilians who had wandered too close out of the same morbid curiosity that had drawn Taehyun and his cousin here in the first place. He was moving before he finished registering the danger. That was becoming a pattern he did not have time to examine yet. He put himself between the creature and the civilians and felt something shift inside him the instant he did, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with exertion. It was not predation. Predation was hunger, was the drive to take something and make it his own. This was different, steadier, something that flared brightest when he stood between danger and people who could not protect themselves. He would not have a name for it until much later. Monarch's heart, when he finally learned what to call it, would turn out to be exactly this, a power that grew stronger the more genuinely he meant to protect what stood behind him. The creature struck. He caught the blow on the same forearm he had used against the first monster, and this time the absorption came faster, cleaner, as if his body had learned something from the first exchange that it did not need to relearn from scratch. He felt the strike's force get folded into him rather than simply blocked, felt the presence in his chest catalog the sensation with the same eager attention it had shown twice already that morning. He drove forward before the creature could recover its stance, using the same studied precision that had ended the first fight, except now there was more weight behind it, more certainty in his own body's ability to follow through on what his mind demanded of it. The strike landed clean. The creature staggered, then folded, then stopped moving entirely, and the presence inside him pulsed once more, warm and satisfied, another thread woven into whatever he was becoming. Behind him, the captain with the radio had stopped shouting. She was staring instead, the way people stare at something that does not fit inside any category their training prepared them for. A third and fourth shape emerged from the widening seam before Taehyun had a chance to catch his breath, and he understood then that the true scope of this breach was still unfolding, that whatever the maintenance crew's readings had promised the association that morning bore almost no relationship to what was actually clawing its way into the world. He heard sirens in the distance, still too far to matter for the next several minutes, and settled into the grim calculation of a man who had already died once and did not intend to let that happen to anyone standing behind him today. Jae-yong, to his credit, had not run. He had done something almost as reckless, which was to start shepherding the scattered civilians away from the platform edge himself, shouting directions with more authority than a delinquent teenager usually had reason to project, pulling an elderly man by the sleeve toward the exit stairs, while a woman with a stroller hesitated over which direction actually led to safety. Taehyun caught sight of this between exchanges and felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with combat. His cousin had never been useless. The world had simply never given him a moment large enough to prove it in. The third creature came at Taehyun low and fast, clearly having learned nothing from the fate of the two before it, and he met it with the same brutal efficiency, catching a limb meant to disembowel him and turning the creature's own momentum into the force that ended it. The fourth held back, circling instead of charging, and for the first time that morning, Taehyun felt something that might have been actual thought behind a monster's eyes, rather than raw animal aggression. He did not give it time to think further. He closed the distance himself, forcing the engagement onto his own terms before the creature could organize whatever instinct was telling it to wait, and ended the fight with the same brutal precision that was quickly becoming a signature rather than a fluke. The presence in his chest, by the time the fourth creature stopped moving, felt different than it had that morning. Fuller, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with physical weight. He could feel, distantly, the outline of new abilities settling into whatever internal architecture predation used to store what it took, though he had no way yet to inventory them properly. That would come later, once he found a quiet moment and the strange status window his death had apparently granted him along with everything else. Sirens grew louder. Backup finally arrived in the form of 3 additional licensed teams and a pair of officials in the darker uniforms that marked association oversight rather than city contract work. And Taehyun understood immediately that the next several minutes required a different kind of careful than the fight had. He was unlicensed. Unawakened, as far as any official record was concerned. A 19-year-old who had just single-handedly ended an A-rank breach that 4 trained licensed players had been caught flat-footed by. That was not a story he wanted circulating with his name attached to it yet. Not before he understood what he actually was, or how much of it he wanted the world to see. He faded back from the platform edge before the oversight officials could fix their attention on him specifically, letting the confusion of the aftermath work in his favor. The scattered civilians and shaken licensed players all trying to reconstruct in their own heads what exactly had just happened and who exactly had done it. Jae-yong found him a few minutes later, breathing hard from ushering the last of the stragglers to safety, and looked at his cousin with an expression that had graduated from confusion into something closer to reverence. He did not ask what Taehyun was. He only asked if he was all right, which told Taehyun everything he needed to know about where his cousin's loyalty actually sat, unconditional and uncomplicated in a way that the rest of the world had never once offered him. They walked home together, while the association's cleanup crews swarmed the station behind them, and Taehyun spent the walk turning over the shape of the morning in his mind. 2 encounters now. 2 demonstrations that whatever the king had given him back on that subway platform was not a single trick but a system, one that grew every time he used it against something worth growing from. He thought about the report he remembered reading in his old life, the flat, bureaucratic footnote describing this breach as a contained C-rank incident with minor equipment damage. The report had lied, or more likely had simply never known the truth, because the truth had been standing in the middle of the platform wearing a 19-year-old's face. That night, alone in his room again, he finally found the nerve to reach for the status window the presence in his chest seemed to be hinting at every time he focused inward. It resolved in front of him without fanfare, a translucent panel only he could see, listing a name, a level that meant nothing yet without context, and beneath it, a small and growing list of abilities he did not remember earning individually, but which sat there anyway, evidence in cold text of everything the day had cost the monsters at that station. He read the list twice. He did not fully understand every entry. He understood enough to know that whatever he was building here, month by stolen month, was not going to stay small for long. The next several days passed in a strange rhythm of ordinary and impossible layered on top of each other. School continued, indifferent to the fact that one of its least remarkable students had quietly become something the association would have paid enormous attention to if they had known where to look. Ba-Huku kept his distance, having apparently decided that whatever had changed in Taehyun was not worth testing twice. Jae-yong, for his part, began treating his cousin with a mixture of awe and proprietary pride, telling anyone who would half listen that his cousin was going to be somebody someday, without any real specifics to back the claim, because the specifics were not his to share. Taehyun used the quiet days to think about what came next. He remembered, in outline if not perfect detail, the shape of the path that lay ahead of him in his first life, or rather the path he had only heard about secondhand from safer distances. There were unlicensed dungeons scattered through the city that a resourceful and sufficiently strong person could clear for money and rare materials without the scrutiny that came with an official license. There was a stealth assassination attempt on a rising hero figure named An Hyun-soo that he remembered reading about months after the fact, one that had nearly succeeded and had been quietly hushed up by the association to avoid public panic. There were player license tests on the horizon, multiple rounds designed to filter the merely awakened from the genuinely dangerous, and he intended to walk into those tests carrying far more weight than anyone administering them would expect from an unremarkable applicant. He decided to start smaller than any of that, though. Before national assassination plots and license exams, he wanted to understand the actual limits of what predation and Monarch's heart could do, in circumstances he controlled rather than circumstances a misjudged gate handed him. Unlicensed dungeons were the obvious answer. Small, contained, dangerous enough to be worth the risk, and unremarkable enough not to draw the kind of attention a repeat of the train station incident would invite. He spent an evening researching entry points through channels that existed just outside legitimate association oversight, the kind of information a support worker in his old life had known intimately and a 19-year-old currently had no obvious reason to know at all. He was careful about that discrepancy. Foreknowledge was an asset only as long as nobody noticed how consistently accurate his instincts turned out to be. His first unlicensed dungeon clear came 4 days after the station incident. A shallow, unremarkable rift beneath an abandoned textile warehouse that the Alchemist Guild's informal network had flagged as low priority and low risk. He went in expecting an easy test of his new abilities against low-tier threats. He found instead that low-tier threats barely registered as threats at all anymore, and that the real value of the outing lay in what he learned about predation's mechanics rather than any danger the dungeon itself posed. He discovered, clearing that first shallow rift, that predation did not simply absorb force the way it had against Ba-Huku's shove or the station monster's strikes. It could, under the right conditions, absorb something closer to ability itself, a thin thread of whatever passive trait a defeated creature carried, folding itself into his own growing collection. He killed a cluster of spider women nesting in the warehouse's lower level and came away from the fight with a faint, uncanny improvement to his own reflexes that had not been there an hour before, a gift the presence in his chest seemed almost gleeful to deliver. He also discovered, in that same dungeon, the beginning of a limit that would matter enormously later. Using predation repeatedly in a short span left a kind of residue behind, a fatigue that was not physical in any way his old body would have recognized, but which nonetheless made the next activation feel heavier, slower to answer his intent. He did not push far enough that first outing to learn exactly where the danger threshold sat. He only learned that a threshold existed, and filed the knowledge away with the same careful attention he had once given to studying martial arts manuals nobody else believed were worth his time. The dungeon runs continued over the following 2 weeks, each one a little deeper, a little more deliberate, Taehyun mapping the edges of his own new existence, one shallow rift at a time. He gained a VIP card from an Alchemist Guild contact impressed by the quality and consistency of the rare materials he kept bringing back, unaware that the materials came so easily to him because the monsters guarding them barely qualified as obstacles anymore. He gained, too, a small and growing sense of who he actually was becoming, separate from the frightened, striving man who had died on a subway platform believing effort alone had ever been enough. He had not forgotten the assassination attempt on An Hyun-soo. If anything, the weeks of careful, controlled testing had only sharpened his intention to be standing somewhere useful when that particular night arrived, close enough to intervene, far enough to remain the quiet variable nobody in the official record would think to name. The night the assassin came for An Hyun-soo arrived exactly as Taehyun remembered it arriving, quiet and unremarkable right up until it wasn't. An Hyun-soo was, by that point, a name every awakened teenager in the city could recognize on sight. He had cleared his first S-rank dungeon at 17, a feat rare enough that the association had already begun quietly grooming him as the kind of public face that made the whole system look good, a hero the country could point to and say, "This is what strength looks like when it belongs to someone decent." Taehyun had known him only distantly in his first life, a name in reports, a face on broadcasts, someone whose eventual fate he had learned about only after it was already old news. In his first life, the assassination attempt had failed to kill Hyun-soo, but not by much, and not because anyone official had intervened in time. It had failed because of a stranger who happened to be nearby, someone the reports never identified, someone whose intervention had been dismissed in the official record as an unlicensed bystander who fled before authorities arrived. Taehyun remembered reading that detail with mild curiosity once, wondering who the stranger had been and why they never came forward. He understood now, standing in the shadow of a parking structure 2 blocks from where the attempt was scheduled to happen, that the stranger in the report was about to be him. He had positioned himself carefully, close enough to the residential building where Hyun-soo was staying that night to intervene quickly, far enough that his presence would not register as suspicious to anyone doing a casual sweep of the area. He did not know exactly which direction the assassin would come from. He only knew, from the flat, bureaucratic language of a report he had read once in another life, that the attempt would happen sometime after midnight, and that it would very nearly succeed. Midnight came and went without incident. Taehyun waited, patient in the particular way a man who has already died once learns to be patient, watching the building's rear entrance from a gap between 2 parked delivery trucks. It was nearly 1 in the morning when he felt it, a wrongness in the air that had nothing to do with sound or movement, a pressure his instincts had started registering ever since the station incident whenever something dangerous drew close. The assassin moved along the rooftops rather than the street, which was why the official sweep teams had missed him twice already that night. He was awakened with some manner of stealth-oriented ability, a passive suppression that dulled sound and dimmed the edges of his silhouette enough to slip past most conventional detection. Taehyun would not have caught him either, if he had been relying on conventional senses. He was not relying on conventional senses anymore. The assassin dropped from the rooftop to a 3rd-floor balcony, with barely a whisper of displaced air, working a thin blade free from beneath his coat with the unhurried confidence of a professional who had done this before and expected to do it again after tonight. Taehyun was already moving, cutting across the alley and up the fire escape on the building's opposite side, aware that he had perhaps 10 seconds before the man reached Hyun-soo's window. He made it with 2 seconds to spare. The assassin's blade was already extended toward the gap in the curtain when Taehyun's hand closed around his wrist from behind, the same economical catch he had used against Bahuku's shove all those weeks ago, except this time, the man on the other end of it was trained to kill and reacted with a speed that would have ended most unawakened teenagers in the first half-second. Taehyun was not most unawakened teenagers anymore. The assassin twisted, trying to bring the blade around in a reversal that clearly worked against most opponents who managed to catch his first strike, and found instead that his wrist would not turn the way his body was telling it to turn. Predation had already folded itself around the joint the instant contact was made, some instinctive extension of the same absorption that had turned monster strikes into raw information back at the station. The man's confusion lasted less than a second before it curdled into something closer to alarm. He was good. Taehyun would give him that much credit even while ending him. The assassin abandoned the blade attempt entirely and went for something faster, a close-range strike meant to disable rather than kill, buying himself room to disengage and reassess an opponent who was clearly not the sedated teenage hero he had been briefed to expect. Taehyun let the strike land, absorbed the force the same way he had absorbed everything else that had hit him since waking up in this borrowed month, and used the half-second of the assassin's own hesitation to end the exchange. It was not a clean kill. Taehyun did not want it to be. He needed information more than he needed a body, and a dead assassin answered no questions about who had sent him or how many more attempts might be waiting in the weeks ahead. He drove the man down hard enough to disable rather than destroy, pinning him against the balcony railing with enough force that further struggle would have cost the man the arm currently trapped beneath Taehyun's grip. The interrogation that followed was brief and unpleasant, and told him less than he had hoped. The assassin worked through layers of contractors, the kind of arrangement designed specifically so that the man holding the blade never actually knew who was paying for it. He gave up a courier's description and a rendezvous location before Taehyun judged that further pressure would only produce lies born of desperation, rather than useful truth. He left the man unconscious and zip-tied to the balcony railing with cord scavenged from a nearby maintenance closet, and slipped away before the noise of the struggle drew attention from inside the apartment. And Hyun-soo, as far as Taehyun knew, never learned how close he had come that night, never learned the name or face of the stranger the eventual report would fail to properly identify. That suited Taehyun fine. He had not saved the boy for recognition. He had saved him because the timeline he remembered depended on Hyun-soo surviving long enough to matter later, and because some old, stubborn part of him simply could not walk past a preventable death anymore. Not after everything the last month had cost him to relearn about what he was capable of. The courier lead went nowhere useful in the days that followed, swallowed into whatever larger conspiracy had ordered the hit, and Taehyun let it go, rather than risk exposing himself chasing a thread that led nowhere he could act on yet. He filed the entire episode away as confirmation of something he already suspected. His return had not simply restored the world to the shape he remembered. Small variables were already shifting, threads of consequence branching in directions his foreknowledge could not fully predict. He would have to stay adaptable, not just informed. The player license tests opened for registration 2 weeks later, and Taehyun submitted his application under his own name, aware that the moment had finally come to step, at least partially, into the light. The first round was structured as a battle royale of sorts. Several dozen applicants dropped into a controlled arena with instructions to collect colored plates from defeated opponents. The plates functioning as a rough proxy for combat performance the examiners could later cross-reference against more detailed testing. It was designed to separate the merely awakened from the genuinely dangerous without requiring the association to expose examiners to real risk, and it was, Taehyun remembered, the round where several names that would matter later first crossed his path. He recognized Hong Jong-wook immediately, a broad-shouldered applicant already nicknamed Iron Fist by classmates who had seen him spar, moving through the arena with the blunt confidence of someone who had never lost a fight that mattered to him. He recognized Shin Yun-bak as well, a leaner competitor with a reputation for lightning-fast strikes that had earned him the nickname God of Thunder among the testing pool, currently cutting through lesser applicants with an efficiency that suggested the nickname was not entirely exaggeration. And he recognized, with a small, private note of interest, Lima Young, a composed young woman moving through the chaos with a controlled economy of motion that marked her instantly as a cut above most of the field around her. The kind of applicant examiners quietly flagged as future S-rank material before the results even came in. Taehyun had no intention of announcing what he actually was in front of an audience this large. He moved through the early stages of the battle royale with deliberate restraint, taking plates from weaker applicants with efficient, unremarkable technique that could pass for a talented but ordinary awakened teenager, rather than something the association's classification system had no proper box for yet. It cost him some effort, holding back that much, a strange kind of fatigue that had nothing to do with predation's mechanical limits and everything to do with the discipline of hiding strength he had spent weeks learning he actually possessed. He collected plates steadily, avoiding direct confrontation with the stronger applicants for as long as the arena's shrinking boundaries allowed, watching Hong Jong-wook and Shin Yun-bak carve through the middle of the field with growing reputations and growing plate counts. Lim A-young, he noticed, was doing something similar to what he was doing, conserving her strength, choosing engagements carefully, a habit that told him she was smarter than her classmates gave her credit for, and considerably more dangerous than her current plate count suggested. The arena's boundaries collapsed eventually into a final cluster of perhaps a dozen remaining applicants, and Tae-hyun found himself with no further room to avoid the fights he had been sidestepping all afternoon. Hong Jong-wook came at him first, mistaking his restraint for weakness, the way most people who relied on raw power tended to mistake anything quiet for something soft. Tae-hyun let the first exchange play out close to even, testing the man's actual capability rather than ending things immediately, and found Hong Jong-wook's strength considerable but straightforward, the kind of power that had never needed subtlety because it had never needed to develop any. He ended the exchange with a single precise strike that took the larger applicant off his feet, careful to leave the performance looking like skill and timing rather than the enormous gap in raw capability that actually decided the outcome. Shin Yun-bak proved a sharper problem. His speed genuinely impressive even measured against what Tae-hyun's borrowed strength could answer with. Several exchanges passing in rapid, inconclusive flashes before Tae-hyun found the opening his instincts had been waiting for and closed the fight the same way he had closed every fight since waking up in this stolen month. Decisively, without unnecessary cruelty, without revealing more than the moment strictly required. Lim A-young was the last obstacle standing between him and the qualifying position the examiners were tracking, and she came at him with a composure that told him she had been watching his fights as carefully as he had been watching hers. She did not open with her strongest technique. She probed first, testing his reactions the way a careful fighter tests an opponent she has not fully measured yet, and Tae-hyun found himself, for the first time all day, genuinely engaged rather than simply managing an outcome he already knew. He won that exchange too, in the end, though it cost him more restraint than any fight that day to keep the margin looking narrow rather than absolute. Lim A-young went down with an expression that held more curiosity than frustration, the look of someone filing away a question rather than accepting a defeat, and Tae-hyun understood, watching that expression settle over her face, that she was going to be paying very close attention to him from this point forward. He finished the first round qualifying near the top of the pool, high enough to draw notice, careful enough that the notice stayed within the bounds of talented rather than impossible. Somewhere in the observation gallery above the arena, examiners were already updating projections and rankings, unaware that the numbers they were writing down represented only the smallest fraction of what the applicant in question actually carried inside him. The second round of testing was announced 3 days later, and the format itself told experienced applicants everything they needed to know about how the association intended to separate genuine talent from applicants who had simply gotten lucky in a controlled arena. Round 2 moved the tests out of a sealed environment and into an actual dungeon expedition, supervised but real, the kind of test that could not be gamed through restraint alone because real dungeons did not care how much an applicant wanted to hide their strength. Tae-hyun remembered this round only vaguely from his first life, a footnote about a testing group that had run into unexpected trouble and lost several applicants before extraction, quietly folded into the association's internal review process and never fully explained to the public. He had not remembered names. He had not remembered that one of the men responsible for assigning testing groups to dungeons was named M-Hawk, a mid-level inspector with a reputation, whispered rather than official, for occasionally steering easier assignments toward applicants whose families had made the right introductions. He met M-Hawk on the morning the groups were assigned, a tired-looking man in his 40s with the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent 2 decades doing a job that never quite paid enough for the risk it carried. M-Hawk did not strike Tae-hyun as cruel, exactly. He struck him as compromised. The kind of man who had made small, justifiable-feeling compromises for so long that the line between reasonable pragmatism and quiet corruption had blurred past the point where he noticed it crossing. The dungeon assigned to Taehyun's testing group was logged in the official paperwork as a standard C-rank clearance site, the kind of dungeon that should have posed manageable risk to a group of license applicants under supervised conditions. Taehyun had no memory of this particular dungeon from his first life. No footnote, no report, which unsettled him more than a familiar danger would have. He was operating blind here, foreknowledge offering him nothing beyond a vague, uneasy sense that something about the assignment did not sit right. He noticed, boarding the transport with the rest of his testing group, that Lima Young had been assigned to the same site, along with several other applicants he did not know personally, but recognized from the Battle Royale's upper rankings. He noticed too that Mhawk, overseeing the assignment logistics personally, rather than delegating to a junior staffer, seemed distracted in a way that read less like simple fatigue, and more like a man carrying a weight he had not chosen to carry. The dungeon entrance looked unremarkable from the outside, a modest rift tucked into a hillside outside the city, the kind of gate that barely registered as dangerous to anyone who had watched a full A-rank breach the way Taehyun had a month earlier. The group descended in standard formation, examiners trailing at a careful distance to observe without directly assisting, and for the first 20 minutes the dungeon behaved exactly the way a C-rank clearance site should have behaved. Low-tier monsters, manageable terrain, nothing that tested more than basic competence. Then the corridor split in a direction the official mapping had not accounted for. Taehyun felt it before anyone else in the group registered anything wrong. The same instinctive pressure that had warned him about the assassin on the rooftop, a wrongness in the air that had nothing to do with anything the group's readings were picking up. He said as much to the nearest examiner, who dismissed the concern with the polite condescension usually reserved for overeager applicants, and the group continued forward into a passage that the dungeon's original mapping had never included. The illusion hit without warning. One moment the corridor was stone and shadow, the readings steady and unremarkable. The next, the walls dissolved into something that looked, to every sense except whatever instinct predation had sharpened in Taehyun, like an entirely different dungeon, one built around a throne room and a scattering of armored figures that rose from the floor with the slow, deliberate menace of things that had been waiting a very long time for someone to disturb them. Death Knights, or something built to look exactly like Death Knights, convincing enough that half the testing group froze in the particular paralysis that comes from a threat assessment collapsing all at once. Taehyun understood, in the space of a single heartbeat, that this was not the dungeon anyone had been briefed to expect. The C-rank clearance site had been a false label sitting on top of something the association's own instruments had never properly measured, and the passage they had wandered into by accident, or perhaps by something less innocent than accident, had dropped them into whatever lay beneath. The examiner's composure shattered along with everyone else's. One of them shouted an evacuation order that nobody had a clear path to follow, the illusion's disorienting geometry making the corridor they had entered through impossible to relocate with any confidence. Applicants scattered, some toward genuine death knights that turned out to be exactly as dangerous as they looked. Others toward phantom threats the illusion conjured that dissolved the moment anyone actually struck them. The whole engagement a chaotic mess of real danger tangled with false. Lima Young, to her credit, kept her head faster than most, falling into a defensive stance and calling out warnings to nearby applicants rather than freezing. Taehyun moved toward the center of the chaos rather than away from it, some old instinct from his support worker years overriding any impulse toward self-preservation, aware that whatever was actually dangerous in this false throne room was going to reveal itself soonest to whoever engaged closest to the source. Mihawk was the one who found it first, and the finding cost him everything. The inspector had descended into the corridor alongside the group, breaking protocol that usually kept assignment staff at a safe remove from active testing, driven by something Taehyun would only understand later, a guilt too heavy to leave unaddressed once the situation clearly exceeded anything the man had signed off on in good conscience. Mhawk pushed forward into the illusion's thickest cluster of phantom knights, buying time and space for a cluster of younger applicants who had frozen completely, shouting for them to move even as something real finally separated itself from the illusion's crowd of fakes. The Dungeon Lord revealed itself the way true threats and illusion traps always eventually reveal themselves, by being the one thing in the chaos that did not dissolve when struck. It was an S-rank Death Knight commander, armored in something that looked forged rather than grown. and it moved through the scattering applicants with the calm, economical violence of something that had killed many groups exactly like this one before today. Mhawk put himself between it and three-cornered applicants who had no path to retreat, and the Dungeon Lord did not slow down to acknowledge the interruption. Taehyun was already moving, cutting through the illusion's remaining phantom clutter with brutal efficiency, aware that he was not going to reach Mhawk in time to prevent what was about to happen, only in time to make sure it did not happen to anyone else standing near him. He was right. He did not make it in time. Mhawk bought the three-cornered applicants perhaps 4 seconds with his body, 4 seconds that let them scramble past the Dungeon Lord's reach toward a section of corridor that had not yet dissolved into illusion, and the cost of those 4 seconds was total. Taehyun arrived close enough to see the end of it, close enough that the image would stay with him longer than he wanted it to. An inspector who had spent 2 decades making small, compromising choices, finally making one that cost him everything and asked for nothing in return. There was no time to grieve properly. The Dungeon Lord turned from what remained of Mhawk toward the nearest remaining threat, which was now Taehyun, and the calculation in its movement told him this was not a fight he could win using the same careful restraint he had shown all through the license testing so far. This was an S-rank threat, and the strength he had been deliberately hiding since the Battle Royale would not be enough on its own to guarantee he walked away from this, let alone the applicants still scattered and vulnerable behind him. His hand found the ring before his mind had fully finished the thought. Mhawk had pressed it into his palm in the chaos. A plain, unremarkable band the inspector had apparently carried, for reasons Taehyun would only learn later. Something inherited or acquired under circumstances the dead man would never get to explain. Whatever it was, it responded the instant Taehyun's intention aligned with its purpose, a sealed pressure inside his own chest breaking loose all at once. Predation, up until this point, had been operating under some manner of restraint he had not fully understood. A limiter placed either by the king's original gift or by his own unconscious caution. The sage's ring tore that restraint away in an instant, and the presence in his chest that had been quietly cataloging everything he absorbed since the subway platform surged forward with a hunger that felt, for the first time, dangerously close to too much. He felt the difference immediately, strength flooding through him in a way that made the Dungeon Lord's next strike feel almost slow by comparison. He caught the blow that would have taken his arm clean off a month ago, and this time nothing about the exchange felt uncertain. He answered with a counter that carried the full, unsealed weight of everything predation had accumulated across the station breach. The unlicensed dungeon clears, the assassin's disabled wrist, every thread woven together into a single, decisive strike. The Dungeon Lord staggered. It was the first time all fight it had shown anything resembling doubt. Taehyun did not let the moment stretch. He drove forward, matching the creature's own brutal economy with something colder and more precise, and ended the exchange the same way he had ended every serious threat since waking up in this borrowed month. Decisively, without wasted movement, without the restraint he had been carefully maintaining in front of witnesses all day. The illusion collapsed the instant the Dungeon Lord fell, the false throne room dissolving back into the modest, unremarkable stone corridor the original mapping had promised, applicants blinking in the sudden return of ordinary light, several of them still shaking from an ordeal that had lasted, in real time, barely 3 minutes. Mhawk's body lay where the illusion had briefly hidden it, and the scattered applicants who owed their lives to those 4 stolen seconds gathered around him with an expression Taehyun recognized from his own worst memories. The particular grief of people realizing too late what someone had actually been willing to give for them. The examiners who reached the corridor minutes later found a group of stunned survivors, a dead inspector, and a testing site logged as C rank that had somehow concealed an S rank threat no official record could explain. Taehyun gave a statement that was careful and mostly true, omitting only the parts that would have required explaining a ring he did not fully understand yet, and a strength that no unawakened applicant should have possessed in the first place. He carried Mhawk's ring home that night, along with a bone-deep exhaustion Predation's mechanics had never fully taught him to expect, the fatigue of unsealed power finally showing him where its true limits actually sat. He thought, lying awake long after his aunt's house had gone quiet, about a compromised, tired man who had spent 2 decades cutting small corners and had spent his last 4 seconds refusing to cut the one that mattered most. He did not know yet what the ring truly was, or why Mhawk had carried it, or what debt the man had been quietly paying down by dying the way he did. He only knew that the testing round the association would later log as a contained anomaly had cost more than any official record would ever admit, and that he intended to make sure, whatever came next, that the cost had not been for nothing. He woke in a hospital bed 2 days later to the particular sterile quiet of a recovery ward, sunlight filtering through blinds that someone had angled to keep the glare off his eyes, and the first face he saw when he finally focused properly belonged to his cousin. Jae-yong had apparently been camped in the visitor's chair long enough that the nurses had stopped bothering to enforce visiting hours against him. He looked exhausted in the specific way people look when they have been frightened for someone else's life rather than their own, and the relief that crossed his face when Taehyun's eyes opened was so raw it made something in Taehyun's chest ache in a way none of Predation's absorbed strikes ever had. His cousin did not ask what had happened in the dungeon. The official report had already circulated in vague, redacted form, enough for Jae-yong to understand that his cousin had survived something that had killed a supervising inspector and nearly killed several applicants, without understanding any of the specifics that actually mattered. Taehyun found he was grateful for that gap. Some things were easier carried alone. The physical recovery took less time than the doctors expected, which surprised no one in his own head, though it clearly unsettled the medical staff assigned to his case. He healed at a pace his patient file had no adequate explanation for, and he offered none, deflecting questions with the tired vagueness of someone who genuinely did not want to discuss the worst day of his second life in more detail than necessary. The offers started arriving before he had even been discharged. The first came from a mid-level recruiter representing the Wanderers Guild, one of the 4 great guilds and the one most associated with information brokering and reconnaissance work, rather than pure combat. The recruiter, a polished young woman who introduced herself simply as working under UA, made her pitch with the practiced ease of someone who had clearly done this before, emphasizing resources, protection, the kind of institutional backing an unaffiliated player would struggle to access on their own. Taehyun listened politely and declined, citing a preference to establish himself independently before committing to any single organization's interests. The recruiter did not push, though something in her expression suggested this was not the last he would hear from the Wanderers. The second offer came more directly from the association itself, a courteous but pointed suggestion that a player who had single-handedly survived an S-rank threat during testing might benefit from formal association sponsorship, the kind of arrangement that came with resources and oversight in equal measure. Taehyun declined that offer too, more carefully this time, aware that turning down the association outright required more diplomatic phrasing than turning down a guild recruiter did. He cited a desire to complete testing on his own merits first, which was true enough, and left unstated the deeper truth that he did not yet trust any institution enough to let it look too closely at what he actually was. He kept M-Hawk's ring through all of it, a plain band he wore on a cord around his neck rather than his finger, unwilling to activate its unsealing function again until he understood it properly, unwilling also to simply discard something a dying man's last act had entrusted to him. He made a private decision, lying in that hospital bed turning the ring over in his fingers, to find out eventually what debt it represented and to make sure, in whatever way he eventually could, that M-Hawk's family understood what the man had actually done in his final seconds. The third round of testing was rescheduled twice in the aftermath of the dungeon incident. Association bureaucracy grinding through review processes that Taehyun suspected existed, mostly to generate the appearance of accountability, rather than any genuine structural fix. When the round finally proceeded, it did so under noticeably tighter security. Examiners doubled at every checkpoint, contingency protocols rehearsed in advance in a way that told him the previous incident had rattled the organization more than its public statements admitted. The third round tested something closer to raw combat capability than either of the first two, a series of one-on-one matches against fellow finalists, scored not just on victory but on technique, adaptability, and control under pressure. Taehyun had spent the recovery weeks deciding that restraint no longer served him the way it had during the Battle Royale. Memhawk's death and the Dungeon Lord's true rank had taught him something uncomfortable about the cost of hiding strength when the stakes were real rather than theoretical. He intended, in this final round, to stop pretending to be merely talented. He faced Hong Jong-wook again in an early match, and this time did not bother extending the fight to preserve appearances, ending the exchange in a handful of seconds with a decisiveness that drew an audible reaction from the observation gallery. He faced Shin Yun-bak in a later round and dispatched him with the same efficient brutality. the god of thunders celebrated speed-looking, against Taehyun's borrowed and compounding strength, more like a curiosity than an actual threat. His final match of the round was against Lima Young, and it proved, predictably, the closest fight of the day. She had clearly spent the weeks since the Battle Royale training with a focus he suspected was directed specifically at him, adjustments to her stance and reaction speed that suggested she had been studying every fragment of footage the examiners allowed applicants to review. She opened aggressively this time, no probing, straight into a combination that would have ended most opponents in the testing pool within the first several seconds. Taehyun met it, and for a stretch of exchanges that felt considerably longer than it actually was, the fight hung genuinely uncertain in a way none of his other matches that day had. Lima Young fought with a precision that impressed him in a way he had not expected an applicant to manage, and somewhere in the middle of the exchange, in a decision that surprised him even as he made it, he used a technique borrowed from a paralysis-inducing ability he had absorbed weeks earlier from a Spider-Woman in one of his unlicensed dungeon clears, a close-range application that ended the match not through overwhelming force, but through a moment of tactical unpredictability she had no way to have trained against. The technique itself involved enough physical proximity that the observation gallery's murmur afterward carried more amusement than outrage, several onlookers clearly reading more into the maneuver's execution than the tactical reality actually contained. Lima Young's expression, when the match ended, mixed genuine frustration at the loss with something that looked almost like reluctant respect, and a faint, unmistakable color rising in her cheeks that had nothing to do with exertion. He finished the third round as the clear top qualifier, a result that generated considerably more attention than his careful restraint during the earlier rounds had allowed him to avoid. The association's official ranking placed him at S rank on his very first classification, an outcome rare enough that it drew notice from press outlets that covered player rankings the way some countries covered professional sports. He accepted the classification with the same careful, understated public demeanor he had maintained throughout testing, aware that the harder work of managing what this new visibility meant for him was only beginning. Jae-yong, watching the announcement from the observation gallery, made no effort at all to contain his pride, loudly informing several strangers nearby that the newly minted S-rank player was, in fact, his cousin, a claim that earned him more skeptical looks than confirmations, but which he repeated anyway, with the shameless enthusiasm of someone who had waited his whole life to be right about something this large. The weeks following his classification passed in a blur of unlicensed dungeon clears, Taehyun using his newly legitimate standing as cover to continue testing the edges of his own growing power against progressively more dangerous rifts, each clear adding another thread to Predation's accumulating collection. He defeated a gym-affiliated rival applicant who fashioned himself something of a local legend under the nickname Iron Man, the fight barely making it past its opening exchange before ending in the same brisk, efficient manner that was quickly becoming his signature. He gained standing with the Alchemist Guild through a string of dungeon clears that produced rare materials at a consistency the Guild's contacts found difficult to explain, eventually earning him a VIP card that opened doors most freshly classified S-rank players would have waited years to access. It was during this stretch, roughly a month after his classification, that the East Point situation began building toward the crisis Taehyun remembered from his first life, with considerably more dread than most of his other foreknowledge carried. He remembered East Point as a public auction event, ostensibly a legitimate gathering of licensed collectors and guild representatives trading rare materials and artifacts recovered from dungeon clears across the region, the kind of event that drew enough wealth and visibility to make security a serious consideration. What the official record of his first life had eventually revealed, months after the fact, was that the event had been infiltrated by a cult faction led by a man named Narendra Nero, an S-rank terrorist whose group intended to use the gathered hostages as sacrifice fuel for a summoning ritual targeting something considerably worse than anything East Point's private security had been prepared to handle. He had read about the aftermath in his first life as a distant news story, the kind of tragedy that happened to other people in other cities, never imagining he would one day find himself standing in the middle of it with the specific knowledge of exactly how it was supposed to unfold. He requested and received an invitation to the East Point auction through channels his S-rank classification and Alchemist Guild standing made newly available to him, arriving several days before the event with the express intention of identifying whatever preparatory groundwork Nero's faction had already laid. He found, working quietly through the venue's security roster in the days leading up to the auction, a name that troubled him more than he expected. The venue's head of security, a man with an otherwise clean record, had accepted payments through a shell arrangement that traced, after considerable digging, back to accounts associated with Nero's broader cult network. The corrupt security chief was, in effect, the reason the sacrifice ritual was going to succeed as thoroughly as it had in Taehyun's first life, his cooperation ensuring that certain access points and monitoring blind spots stayed conveniently unaddressed on the night in question. Taehyun did not confront the man directly before the event. Confrontation without proof would only tip Nero's faction toward moving up their timeline or shifting locations entirely, and he needed the ritual's preparation to stay on the schedule he remembered in order to intervene at the moment that would save the most lives. He instead spent the days before the auction quietly gathering evidence, cross-referencing shipping manifests and access logs through contacts the Alchemist Guild's VIP standing made available to him, building a case he intended to present the instant the situation demanded it. The night of the auction arrived with the venue lit in the tasteful, expensive glow of an event designed to make wealthy collectors feel like they were participating in something exclusive rather than simply spending money. Taehyun moved through the crowd in a borrowed formal jacket that fit poorly enough to mark him as someone who had not attended many events like this, nodding politely at conversations he had no real interest in, while tracking the movement of security personnel with the same instinctive attention he had once used to track monster patterns in unlicensed dungeons. The ritual, when it began, did not announce itself with the dramatic flourish television dramas usually assigned to these things. It began quietly, a subtle dimming of the venue's ambient lighting that most guests dismissed as a scheduled transition into the auction's main event, masking the moment Nero's faction moved the first cluster of selected hostages toward a service corridor that the corrupt security chief had ensured stayed conveniently unmonitored. Taehyun caught the shift before anyone else in the room registered it as anything other than atmosphere, the same wrongness sense that had warned him about the assassin on the rooftop and the illusion trap in the testing dungeon, flaring now with an intensity that told him the timeline he remembered was already accelerating past whatever margin he had planned around. He moved. The service corridor led down toward a section of the venue's lower levels that the official floor plan listed as storage, and Taehyun found, descending quickly and quietly enough to avoid drawing attention from the cultists positioned as lookouts, that Nero's faction had converted the space into something considerably more elaborate than storage. A ritual circle already partially inscribed across the concrete floor. Hostages bound and gagged along one wall under the watch of 3 armed cultists, who wore their faction's markings with the casual confidence of people who did not expect interruption. He dealt with the lookouts quickly, using Predation's accumulated speed and the paralysis technique he had used against Lima Young to incapacitate, rather than kill where the option existed, aware that living witnesses would matter considerably more than corpses when it came to unraveling how deep Nero's infiltration actually ran. He freed the bound hostages as quickly as the situation allowed, directing them toward the service corridor and the exit beyond it, and turned to find Narendra Nero himself standing at the center of the half-completed ritual circle, watching him with an expression that held far more curiosity than alarm. Nero was not what Taehyun expected. He had imagined, from the flat description in his first life's news coverage, someone theatrical, wild-eyed, the kind of cult leader public imagination tends to picture. The man standing across the ritual circle instead carried himself with the calm, unhurried confidence of someone who had planned for interruptions and did not consider them a serious threat to his larger goal. Nero did not bother with a lengthy villain's monologue. He simply observed, almost academically, that an unlicensed applicant intervening this early was an inconvenience rather than a genuine obstacle, and moved to complete what remained of his ritual with the efficient disregard of a man who considered the hostages' lives an acceptable cost for whatever he intended to summon. Taehyun closed the distance before he finished the thought. The fight that followed was, by a wide margin, the most dangerous single exchange Taehyun had faced since the S-rank Death Knight commander in the testing dungeon. Nero's own abilities carrying a corrupted, unstable quality that made every strike unpredictable, in ways his accumulated experience had not fully prepared him for. Nero fought with a blend of raw combat skill and a summoning adjacent power that let him briefly manifest fragments of whatever entity his ritual had been calling toward, small, distorted echoes of something considerably larger and worse waiting on the other side of whatever door he had been trying to open. Taehyun absorbed what he could of the exchange, predation cataloging fragments of the corrupted power even as he fought to end the confrontation before the ritual circle's remaining inscriptions could complete themselves, and found, in the final decisive exchange, that the accumulated weight of everything he had gathered since the subway platform, the station monsters, the assassin's disabled wrist, the Death Knight commander's raw power, the paralysis technique from the Spider-Woman, folded together into a strike considerably more than the sum of its individual parts. Nero went down hard enough that the half-finished ritual circle's inscriptions sputtered and died along with him, whatever fragment of summoned presence he had been channeling collapsing back into whatever space it had been reaching from. Security teams arrived in the aftermath to find a defeated terrorist leader, a room full of freed hostages, and evidence, which Taehyun made sure was impossible to ignore, implicating the venue's own head of security in the entire conspiracy. The corrupt chief's arrest made considerably more noise in the following days than Taehyun's own role in preventing the massacre, which suited him fine, his name appearing in official reports only as an alert bystander whose intervention had proven fortunate rather than as the singular reason dozens of people walked out of that service corridor alive. The association's classification board revisited his standing within the week, the East Point intervention combined with his testing performance and a growing, quiet awareness among certain officials that something about this particular S-rank player did not fit any pattern they were used to tracking, and elevated him formally to national-level status, a tier reserved for players whose demonstrated capability marked them as genuine assets to their country's defense against the abyss. Taehyun accepted the elevation with the same careful, understated composure he had maintained through every escalation so far, aware even as the ceremony concluded that national-level status was not an ending point, but simply the next threshold in a climb he now understood, with a clarity his first life had never afforded him, stretched considerably higher than anything the association's own ranking system had names for yet. The Rosaria situation found him rather than the other way around, which was itself unusual enough that Taehyun approached it with more caution than his growing confidence usually demanded. It began with a string of disappearances near a modest rift on the city's southern edge, awakened men mostly, vanishing after reporting strange, vivid dreams in the days before they went missing. The association had logged the pattern as low priority, the kind of case that got a cursory investigation before being filed away as unremarkable. And Taehyun might have missed it entirely if a passing mention in an internal briefing hadn't tugged at something in his memory, a fragment from his first life he had never fully understood at the time, a footnote about a contracted monster ally whose origin story involved exactly this kind of disappearance pattern. He went to investigate personally rather than trust the association's dismissive assessment, and found, descending into the rift the missing men had all been last seen near, a domain that felt less like a dungeon and more like something built deliberately to entertain, rather than simply exist, lush and strange in ways that made his instincts flare, with a warning that had nothing to do with physical danger. The succubus queen who ruled that domain introduced herself with a directness that surprised him, Rosaria, an archduke-tier being who had apparently grown bored enough with her own territory's isolation to start drawing curious, dreaming men toward her out of something closer to loneliness than genuine malice. She attempted, almost as a formality, to fold him into the same illusion that had claimed the missing men before him, a seductive, mind-clouding pull that Taehyun felt brush against his thoughts with an intensity that should have overwhelmed anyone without his particular borrowed strength standing between him and her influence. It did not take. Monarch's heart, he would understand only later, carried a resistance to exactly this kind of domination that had nothing to do with willpower and everything to do with the nature of the power itself, a thread woven from something that refused, on some fundamental level, to submit to another being's control. Rosaria's surprise at the failure was genuine, and considerably more interesting to her than any of the men she had successfully ensnared before him. She dropped the illusion entirely once it became clear it would not work, regarding him instead with the sharp, evaluating curiosity of someone encountering a puzzle she had not expected to find in a domain this remote. The conversation that followed ran longer than Taehyun expected, Rosaria surprisingly candid once the pretense of seduction fell away, admitting to the disappearances with a shrug that suggested she considered the men's continued, well-treated captivity in her domain a mercy rather than a crime, and speaking, in careful, indirect fragments, about the wider structure of the abyss that Taehyun had only glimpsed the edges of so far. She spoke of archdukes, 7 of them, herself among the lesser but not least of that number, and of something above even the archdukes that she referred to only as the king, a presence whose growing strength was apparently reshaping the balance of power within the abyss in ways that made even established archdukes nervous about what came next. She did not explain further, and Taehyun did not push, aware that the presence coiled in his own chest since the subway platform had gone strangely, attentively quiet during this part of the conversation, as though listening for something specific. He released the captured men before he left, over Rosaria's mild but genuine objection, and in exchange for that concession, and for the novelty of an ally rather than a conquest, Rosaria offered him something considerably rarer than information, a contract, binding her as his first true monster ally rather than an adversary, a relationship built on curiosity and mutual advantage rather than domination in either direction. Taehyun accepted, understanding even as he did that an Archduke-tier contract was going to matter far more in the coming months than the modest, unremarkable rift it had been forged in suggested. The Fire Temple Double Dungeon arrived on his radar barely 2 weeks later, flagged by the Wanderers Guild as a site considerably more dangerous than its official classification indicated, the kind of double dungeon that had only recently begun appearing across the region, with a frequency the association's researchers found increasingly alarming. Yue, the same Wanderers recruiter who had approached him after his testing results, reached out personally this time, not with a recruitment pitch, but with a request, her guild having lost 2 prior scouting teams to the temple's depths and needing strength she suspected, correctly, that Taehyun now possessed in quantities far beyond his official classification. He agreed to join the raid, curious himself about a double dungeon's true nature after the illusion trap that had cost M-Hawk his life, and found Yue considerably more capable in person than her polished recruiter's demeanor had suggested, a guildmaster who had earned her position through genuine strength rather than administrative skill alone. She fought beside him through the temple's early chambers with an aggressive, confident style that occasionally bordered on flirtatious even in the middle of active combat, an energy Taehyun found more amusing than distracting given everything else currently occupying his attention. The temple's depths revealed, after several hours of careful, escalating clearance, a mutant variant of a creature the Wanderers' prior scouting reports had catalogued as merely dangerous, rather than what it actually turned out to be. A corrupted, apocalypse-tier phoenix, considerably stronger than anything the Double Dungeon's official threat assessment had prepared either of them to expect. Taehyun called on Rosaria for the first time since the contract's forging, and found the Archduke's power answering his summons with an ease that told him the bond between them ran deeper than either of them had fully tested yet, her flames meeting the mutant phoenix's own corrupted fire in an exchange that would have obliterated the temple's structural integrity entirely if Yue hadn't held the surrounding chamber's collapsing supports together through her own considerable ability. They brought the phoenix down together, Yue's guild finally securing the scouting data that had cost 2 prior teams their lives, and Taehyun walked away from the Fire Temple with another thread woven into Predation's ever-growing collection, and a working relationship with the Wanderers Guild that stopped well short of the formal recruitment Yue clearly still hoped for eventually. He returned home in the weeks that followed to a life that had, on its surface, settled into something like a rhythm. National-level status, a small circle of allies whose loyalty he was only beginning to understand the weight of, a cousin whose pride in him had become the single most reliable constant in either of his lives, and a growing, quiet certainty that everything he had built so far, the tests passed, the threats defeated, the allies gathered, was only the foundation for something considerably larger waiting just past the horizon of what he currently understood. The Asian Exhibition Games loomed on the calendar barely a month out, an event that would draw the region's strongest players into direct competition and, he suspected, draw considerably more danger toward him than any single tournament's official stakes suggested. Rosaria had spoken of a king whose growing strength unsettled archdukes. The ring around his neck still carried secrets M-Hawk had died without explaining, and somewhere above even the archdukes, in fragments too large for any single conversation to fully outline, something called a superior kingdom watched a king, it clearly considered a threat worth fearing. He did not know yet how much of what was coming he could actually prepare for. He only knew, walking home through streets that had once treated him as invisible and now, slowly, were beginning to whisper his name with something closer to awe, that whatever the king had pulled him back from death to become, he intended to become it on his own terms, one hard-won battle at a time.